welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Hoye. The Psychology Talk podcast is a unique conversation about psychology from around the globe. We bring you ideas from mental health practitioners and experts to keep you informed about the latest issues and trends. Topics include developments and research in psychotherapy and social sciences, hypnosis and mind-body treatments, meditation and spirituality, and new treatment modalities. And while you're listening, please take a moment to subscribe and give us a review at your favorite streaming site. It helps us to grow and further reach people with quality programming. And now, here's the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, my guest is once again Dr. Caroline Carney. Dr. Carney is the president of behavioral health and chief medical officer at Magellan Health. Dr. Carney is here to discuss social media and child and adolescent mental health, as well as adults, and the well-being of our society. Dr. Carney, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's terrific to be back with you.
Same here. Thank you so much for taking the time out on this lovely Friday afternoon.
Absolutely.
So what can you, like, from your perspective as being the head of behavioral health and medicine at Magellan, what's your take on this? I mean, you must be seeing the effect of this statistically and also just like in the lives of people everywhere.
Absolutely. So social media comes with some rewards and some risk. And I think we have to be fair in the conversation and talk about some of the good things that social media can bring, particularly to teens and kids and those who may be in need of contacting with friends or family across the country, particularly, for instance, during times in COVID when we were on lockdowns. But the risks are high, and as a professional and as a parent, I think we really need to pay attention to what those might be for kids and adolescents and even adults as we talk about this conversation. Everything is pretty much applicable across the board, except the risk may be even higher in kids and teens with developing brains.
Absolutely. Well, I've noticed that as iPhones and tablets have been more available and smartphones, I don't want to pick on Apple products alone. I've noticed that people with young children around me, that their young children are kind of being introduced to them as a way to soothe themselves or keep themselves mentally occupied. And I'm wondering if there's any information about how young children's brains are developing differently. To what extent do we know compared to a pre-smartphone or screen-heavy use?
So I want to get to that question, but I want to set up why that question is so important first.
You bet. Okay. I just wanted to put that out there, but okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Because I think it just to talk about the gravity of the question that you just asked. So there was a survey done in 2019 pre-pandemic, and we know that the pandemic has tended to make these numbers worse. That said that 53% of American children owned a smartphone by the age of 11 years old, and 84% of teenagers had their own smartphone. And in assessing the time the teens were spending on their smartphone, it was more than 7 hours a day. And for those in the tween ages, it was a little over 4 hours a day. They resurveyed in 2021, and the teens were up to 8.4 hours a day, and tweens 5.5 hours a day. So our kids are getting a ton of exposure to cell phones and social media through cell phones. So it's a really important question to circle back around. What's this doing for developmental needs of our kids? And there's evidence that it is harming kids in a couple of different ways, primarily. The first is on attention span and concentration. So if a child or adolescent is playing a game where they are moving around quickly or looking at a screen where they can flip through images quickly. It trains our brains to be quick to focus and then to move on and to move on and to move on. So then if you take that child out of that kind of setting and put them in the classroom where they have to pay attention, it's much harder for that child to learn to focus and to concentrate on something, even like reading a book, where that acquires attention for a longer period of time, or watching a television show, even from start to finish, without having that impulse to be on the phone. So neural pathways get laid down in these situations as a child is growing and developing. The other significant component that's related to that is the ability of the developing brain to develop social connectedness with people, the ability to look someone in the eye, to develop the skills to have a conversation, to be able to have a connection with an individual that is truly face-to-face, person-to-person in the community. And so what happens is, because we're so attuned to the phone, it's pretty hard to have that practice as a young child to, say, sit around a table at Thanksgiving and learn how to talk to grandma and grandpa or your aunt and uncle. I see this, like you do, happening all the time. And it's quite concerning to me.
Well, I can see the next DSM having a neurodevelopmental issue due to screen time or something, right. Possibly. Right. So this means that as parents in our society, we have to be very, very diligent. I mean, these technologies and the way they're structured for kind of almost like a reward system, such as a slot machine. I mean, a lot of development has gone into, So
right.
It really
Absolutely.
keeps you hooked to it. As adults, raising children have to be very aware themselves of how these things are seeping into their lives and affecting the development of their children.
So the development of our kids, in addition to those couple kinds of things I mentioned, also goes into sleep, into posture, many other areas, ultimately long-term, earlier development of chronic disease. And so while the developing brain is being affected in significant ways, sleep patterns are being disrupted in kids because of screen time on the blue screen, which is known to affect the release of melatonin for sleep and getting on a normal sleep cycle. So when a child says, I need to have my phone in my bed because I need the alarm for the morning, the parent can say, no, here's a traditional alarm, give me your phone, because of the disruption that has. So let's carry sleep a step forward. The child who doesn't get enough sleep tends to develop during the day self-stimulation that, in a way to try to keep them alert in the classroom or on the playing field or wherever it might be. That looks very much like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And then just the fatigue makes that individual less able to concentrate. So now if you follow it from poor sleep, the child who has to self-stimulate in the classroom, tap a pencil, tap their leg, move in and out of their desk, or just doesn't have concentration because they're tired from those disrupted sleep patterns, may be actually even misdiagnosed with ADHD if someone doesn't take the right history and understand what's going on.
I followed that cookie crumb trail or the breadcrumb trail out of the forest. Yes, I think that, I think a lot of people perhaps are misdiagnosed or improperly diagnosed with ADHD these days. And this is just I could see, unfortunately, lazy clinicians or clinicians not being astute, observational people, doing just what you just said, which
right.
means stimulants will be provided. I don't know if there's been any longitudinal studies of like the use of stimulants and addiction.
Mm-hmm.
But in I guess case studies that I not studies, but cases I've seen when I worked in drug and alcohol facilities, is that there seemed to be a lot of use of Ritalin and Adderall and other things before the age of 10, and developing difficulty with impulse control and and addiction later on. Nothing against those medications, but yeah, I could see that being.
And you see the same pattern in adults who are up and on their phones all night long, have to go to work the next day, didn't put my phone down until 3 a.m. It's pretty hard to get up at 6 and maintain a full day of work. So I think it's something that as clinicians, we really need to be astute to. The other aspect that I really worry about in terms, again, of the developing brain is you alluded to it in the reward kind of actions that those phones bring kids.
Like a variable rate reward system.
So that kind of interaction with looking at a phone when you may get a text back or you may have someone like your post, you look at your phone, you may get it, you may not. You then look at your phone again. It's just like a slot machine, right? It's the same kind of reward mechanism that we use when people gamble, for instance, because it is intermittent reward. Every time you look, you may not have a like, but sometimes you do. And so it keeps the brain drawing back because it develops those patterns that are very similar to things like slot machines. And so effectively, again, you're training this child to respond to intermittent reward, which can, downstream have developmental issues for that child.
Yeah. I wonder how often, it does seem so ubiquitous, right? I'm looking at this and we're talking systemically here, and my brain goes, how will we be able to stem the tide of this overuse of these devices? Will they be regulated more globally by politicians so there's less of this kind of manipulative behavior on the part of tech giants?
Mm-hmm. I hope so, in terms of the algorithms that are being used by the tech giants in drawing people in, using that kind of reward system, and in also the content that they're generating. So the information that came out of Facebook, Instagram regarding young women and eating disorders, and how the artificial intelligence and algorithms drew young women who were particularly vulnerable based on what they had been texting into more and more dangerous content that has been linked to the potential increase we're seeing in eating disorders across adolescents across the country. And that has been a documented practice that Facebook testified to, first reported out by the New York Times. And so I think those are the kinds of things that, as a practitioner and a parent, I think we need to see some regulation on that kind of content and where it drives kids to go. I think it's wide open for change and positive change to turn around some of what has been negative and led to the development of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and so on into something that we could use as a positive force.
So like the kind of idea of a suicide response, like a kind of an orange alert,
right,
if you will, for your child or for somebody connected to you socially. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I could see where there might be problems with HIPAA, but at the same time, you can always break HIPAA if there's an emergency. Right.
Well, and if you're a parent and the rule set around the cell phone you probably bought your child and the internet access in your own home, if there was something to say that's a requirement, the parent gets to see these alerts. They don't have to see all the content, but they could see an alert. I think we could work as a society to turn some of what is disturbing behavior and outcomes into something for positive change.
I think you're right. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the statistics if you have them at hand. I know that Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist, talks about this with a colleague in a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, and the kind of correlation between the release of cell phones and social media and the increase in anxiety and suicide and depression in teens, especially teen girls.
Right. I can talk about some of that. So we think of cell phones as being something that has happened more recently. But in fact, there are writers and researchers who believe that this really started back in 2012, which was the tipping point where more than 50% of Americans owned a smartphone. And if you look at data from that point forward in teens and adolescents and adults, there's a very strong correlation between some of the adverse outcomes for individuals who are in that high use group. And so I think the data look pretty clear from a correlation point of view. Correlation and causation often get mixed up. And I think if we talk about causation, we need to talk about the fact that most individuals don't develop depression and anxiety, but there are some who do. There are some who develop demoralization and that sort of thing from the use of cell phones. And so I think you have to look at it in a certain way, that the good news is not all teens are adversely affected from that psychological point of view. The physical symptoms are very clear, and so we can talk about that later. But social media and the emotional point of view doesn't affect all kids equally. And I think you can think about it like we think about using alcohol. Millions of us have a drink every now and again. Enjoy a glass of wine with a meal or something, for instance. But most of us don't develop alcohol use disorder. And, it's something that alcohol may make us feel good for that period of time, but that continual use doesn't leave us feeling good anymore. And so if you look at social media in that same addiction paradigm that we talked about a little bit ago, we have that risk for individuals developing that kind of behavior where they get sucked in and they can't lose it. The vulnerability for kids also has to be looked at in those children who at baseline have a risk for depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress or an eating disorder because of genetic factors, because of factors at school like bullying, because of adverse circumstances in their home lives. So when you know that there is a risk for a child because of all of those other factors, and they go down that path of using that cell phone, thinking initially it's going to connect them socially, and then they find out that they weren't invited to that party or that someone else got into Harvard and they didn't, and that sort of thing. That's really something that comes together to create those risky situations for development of a true mental health condition, even down the path to suicidality.
Yeah, I think you're right. Statistically, how much have these reported anxiety and the incidence has gone up with depression and anxiety? Do you know that offhand?
So again, correlating that directly to cell phone use, there are statistics that support that correlation. I think the more important statistics that we know recently are those that have come out of the pandemic, looking at the increase in suicide attempts in girls 10 to 14, the affirmation of have you in teens and in young adults, 18 to 29-year-olds, with increases in rates of depression and suicidal ideation. I don't have the numbers on the tip of my tongue, Scott, but the CDC report shows those numbers clearly in cohorts tracked over time over the last couple of years. The other thing that we look at is the utilization of behavioral health services, which have also increased, particularly in young individuals over time, like that 10 to 14-year-old adolescent girl group that I mentioned. Yeah. So the evidence is out there, but again, it's probably a combination of factors. When you go down to an individual case like that young woman who did develop an eating disorder, that's when we'll circle back to the beginning, taking that history, being the clinician who digs in and figures out what those risk factors are that could be modified to help that young woman is really critical.
Yeah, I think that now more than ever, I think that kind of very succinct kind of diagnostic digging down, as you say, is super important to help individuals.
So I also think that there are populations that the pandemic and everything that was fueled around it became noticeable, like young women going to an emergency room. So LGBTQ kids and girls far surpassed boys of all ages, if you look at the curves. So for instance, in one of those CDC studies between February 21st and March 20th of 2021, compared to prior to that time, there was a 50.6% higher risk for girls going to the emergency room compared with only 3.7% for boys ages 12 to 20. And the curves for kids with LGBTQ look really similar to those for girls. And I think you go back to why is that affecting girls? Why is social media affecting girls? And it's probably related just, again, to the developmental stages that kids are going through and the kinds of things that they're vulnerable to that get pushed out on social media. The perfect face, the perfect body, the best friends, the great clothes, all of the things that a teenage girl is comparing herself against. The social activity of her friends, if she's included, if she's not, those sorts of things. And then any bullying that is getting done through social media is also incredibly damaging.
Okay. Well, we mentioned ways a little bit about how parents and people who are concerned with adolescents and children, how they can kind of mediate these things. Maybe we can go a little bit more in depth to that.
Sure, absolutely. So I think as a parent, I have looked at this carefully because I want my kids to have access to social media and to using that kind of medium to connect with their friends. And today it's used every day in classrooms for looking up facts about your homework. And a lot of even homework exercises are pushed out over social media. So the first thing that I would bring up is to say, it's not ever going to be 0 hours a day, and we shouldn't aspire to be 0 hours a day because we're never going to get there in today's world. It simply isn't realistic. So you have to get to an idea about appropriate use at appropriate time and in appropriate space. There was the phrase called phubbing, which was phone snubbing, that came up in the last several years, which was the idea that you're on your phone at the same time you're supposedly holding a conversation with an individual. And that's really a subtle way of snubbing and saying, whoever is contacting me on my phone or whatever alert just came up is more important to me right now than this conversation I'm having with you. So that's clearly a sign that if that's going on with your teen, that you need to weigh in and make sure that your child is going to be put in in that kind of pathway down proper usage of their phone in the right time and space. So there are easy rule sets here. Some of the phones for younger kids in particular, you can set parental controls on those phones, not only on certain websites and the content of those websites, but also the number of hours that an individual can link to those websites. So when my kids were younger, I used to set those kind of controls so that they could access the websites they might need for homework, but they couldn't go into areas that were clearly damaging to them or could lead down a path of distraction away from your homework. So, you can put blocks on any of those websites and you can set the hours on phones. So I really encourage parents to do that. Secondly, I encourage parents to model the right behavior. We fub our children all the time. We pick up our phones when our kids are having a conversation with us. That's damaging to our child, saying whoever's on this phone or that game I'm playing is more important than you. So parents really have to model the right kinds of behaviors. The dinner table is a great example of that. There shouldn't be cell phones at the dinner table. The family meal is the family meal and a time for conversation. We shouldn't be bringing cell phones into that kind of setting. Again, it's something that we need to model. The number of hours in the evening, particularly as we go into sleep time, again, of critical importance. Most research would suggest that we should stay off of our phones for at least an hour before we intend to fall asleep, because the effect of not only the blue light coming from the phones, but also the effect of your brain being engaged and pulled in. And so a parent can take the phone away from the child at that time. If your child goes to bed at 9, they turn the phone in at 8. They don't get to continue on that. I think the next thing that I like to talk about is your kid will push back and say, but all my friends are on, Mom, they get to use it. Why can't I? I think there is a social component of reaching out to other parents and other families and trying to do this at a more community kind of level, because your kid is right. Other kids will be on the phone, and that fear of missing out, FOMO, is definitely going to be something that comes into life. In older kids, I also recommend that the kids who work and have jobs have to have a sense of responsibility, perhaps for paying for some of the time that they're on the internet or they have access, because that sets up that sense of responsibility. And if you have a limited plan, they can't waste that on things that aren't important, especially when they have buy-in to that kind of time. It changes the dynamic of what's happening with that.
Yeah, kind of like the old thing of like maybe having a swear jar. Like
right.
If you go over your time on the phone, you have to put a quarter in.
Right. And behavioral economics would suggest that working backward from that might even be stronger. So if your child gets to start with X number of minutes a day, if they don't get their chore done, they lose minutes. If they don't get their homework done, they lose minutes, and so on. So that's even a more powerful stimulus, which can work well for kids and adults of all ages.
Benefiting a lot of parents out there.
Yeah. And then finally, one of those other you must do this before this kind of thing is physical activity. Kids need to move. In order for brains and bodies to develop along the right way, they need to move. In order for their eyes to develop properly, they need to be off screens. And so getting kids active, engaged, and moving is really, really important. And then finally, setting up social interactions, especially now that we're out of lockdowns, we're back in school. School-related activities are opened again, from young kids up to high school, college kids. Getting your child involved in something where they're not and can't be on their phone. So it's pretty challenging to be on the phone if you're on a basketball court or a soccer field or something where your kid is staying active and off that time.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think those are all wonderful, wonderful ways of looking at it. I especially like the kind of economic kind of plan of minute plan, economic itemized minute plan with your children. I'm going to play devil's advocate here, Dr. Carney.
Sure.
Let's say I have 4 kids. My wife and I, we've been really bad. We've been bringing our phones to the table. We've allowed phones everywhere. And, we watch Netflix at night and then we both look up facts about the show, or, kids are on their screens in their room. How do we implement that after all? We've all been behaving badly. We have to somehow work on our own behavior modification first, and then reset those rules. How would you maybe give advice to that family?
So I think, again, it starts from the top with the parents showing that kind of behavior. And if you can't set your phone down while watching television, you have a problem. I'm guilty of it many times. If I'm watching something passively with my husband that I don't really care about, and there I am, not, just only half engaged. But you have to be able to set your phone down. And if you can't walk away from your phone, there's an issue. And so I think it's critical to recognize it at first. Just like if you can't put that drink down, there might be an issue. So you think about it in terms of, I'm really linked and connected to this, so maybe I'm overly linked and connected to this. So start slow. Start with the half-hour show that you commit to not looking at your phone, and increase that over time so you can train yourself to getting to a place where you're engaged with the people you're around, or the other kind of screen you're around, whether it's a movie screen, a TV screen, or the work that you're supposed to be doing. The iWatch and other kinds of devices have made that challenging because you can get those little alerts saying, someone posted on Facebook or whatever. And so you have to turn off those kind of alerts and reminders as well. If you're trying to work, let's say you're putting together what you need to do for your next podcast and learning all the things you need to learn, but in the corner of your screen, you're getting alerts and notifications all the time, your attention is constantly diverted. And that leads to a much longer time in getting your work product done, and probably a poorer outcome because of that constant distraction. Your brain can't do that. As much as we want to think we can all double and triple task, we really can't. And that kind of distraction affects our productivity. It also overarchingly then affects our well-being. If we can't connect with another human without having this in your hand, it's going long-term to affect quality of relationships. It's been, something that's been raised in relationships about being connected to your spouse, for instance. Back to your example of family with your kids and your wife, and you're looking up stuff, everybody has to engage in it. It's not going to work if it's just you, because no one will engage with you if they're not doing the same thing. So I think you start at the top and you then bring the kids along with you in that process.
Okay. Yeah. Very, very good. Very good. What other issues or like for adults, like how do you think that adults are being affected by social media, like as compared to like some of the statistics you were talking about, correlational statistics, of course, not causation, but it's correlational. Like, how do you think that adults have been affected positively and since we're talking about pathology, we're talking about adversely?
Yeah. So I think at the beginning, I said there were some absolutely positive things about using social media. I think adults that way have been able to connect more closely with grown kids from, across the country or across the world, or their relatives, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, whoever that extended family might be. And it's allowed us to be able to have connections that we might not have been able to foster as easily before. I still remember, when I was in college, if I had to call home, I had to pay a lot for that long distance call,
Yes.
And so you didn't call home that much and have that time. My kids now can engage with me and, we can have that kind of relationship. I think that's a really positive aspect of having the access that we have to cell phones and social media. Adults have been able to be more facile in things like the calendar and spreading the calendar out to members in their family, putting together the kinds of lists we need to do that everyone can add to the grocery list, things that do actually help us with productivity and communication. Those are small examples sitting inside that family mode, but things that are very positive. We also, during the pandemic, saw the very positive effects of having the ability to FaceTime with relatives. The poignant stories we have all seen of individuals in the hospital saying goodbye on a tablet because someone couldn't be in the room with them. That is an incredible, incredible thing that we have in our society today, to be able to have that ability to communicate. It's everything in moderation, right? So these things aren't inherently bad. It's what we do in terms of going outside of moderation that leads to the kinds of challenges that we see. So even for adults, they are at risk for development of depression and anxiety because of overuse of the phone. If you take the person who is an introvert and give them the phone, and it draws them into a more introverted space where they don't have to reach out. For adults, that's also as damaging as it is for kids. I recently read an article about the dating world and how now it's so easy to just scroll through people you might be interested in instead of having to go out and make that true social connection straight away. So some good, some not so good in those kinds of interactions with adults. But the adult is also affected from the physical activity loss because they're drawn into social media or being on their phone. They're also at risk for many of those same kinds of body images or hits to their self-esteem because you saw what your neighbor posted when they were in Florida, and you couldn't afford to go to Florida that year or something. So we're just as susceptible to those same kinds of influences that kids have.
Yeah. I also think too that it's easier to vet people, even just kind of intuitively vet people you're dating. We're both men and women, but I think this is something that women think about a lot more than men do initially. If you meet them at work or a social gathering or church or school, like some sort of, you can kind of find out through the grapevine, hey, I'm interested in so-and-so. Can you tell me about, what do they do? What are they like? Oh, he or she's great, or they're great. That doesn't happen as much anymore. Right. It's like self-marketing and the other potentially deleterious issues like feeling bad about your body image or not right. getting a lot of swipe rights or whatever it is. Yeah. Right. Acceptance.
Right. And that can be damaging. And if we consider those in their young 20s, in that category of adult, of course, they're still developing their brains. They're still in that now highest risk group for considering suicidality. That kind of negative feedback is really damaging.
Yeah. I have I have a number of people in my caseload that are in that age bracket or even older age bracket doing online dating. And it, I have to bite my tongue a bit and listen, learn. But yes, there are a lot of issues there. I mean, you talked about the developing brain in childhood, but like I think the general wisdom is that the cytoarchitecture of the brain doesn't really stop forming till about 25, right?
Right.
It doesn't mean we can't grow or learn a new language or a skill or something as we get older. God forbid we just sit and sit around and not learn anything about this amazing world we're in. But I think that, yes, it's still affecting people up into their early 20s, excessive use of these devices.
Absolutely. And that incredibly important thing to think about in that age group is one of the structures of that developing brain is the impulsivity. All those impulsivity channels have not yet been locked down, nor have those channels about being able to truly see into the future. They can see perhaps very short term, but they can't see that whatever horrible I just learned, I'm going to get through this. There is another day that's ahead of me. That's a good thing. And if you put together that child, 20-year-old, whoever that might be in that developing brain period, with bad incoming social media, the young man whose girlfriend just posted that she's breaking up with him, and that thing, that these are all real kinds of stories. The impulsivity says, I'm going to kill myself. And if they have access and means to do it, that happens.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time. One little technique I use in session is just to say, where are you at right now? Okay, where were you at with this issue 2 months ago, 5 months ago, 6 years, 2 years ago? What would your 5-year-old self say to you? Mm-hmm. How are you different from then? So having gained all these learnings and all of this wisdom, what would your, say, self 2 years from now say to you, looking back on today, as the start of like changing something? But a lot of it's metacognition, right? We're trying to help people have more metacognitive capability for their minds, and I think that that's something we're all striving towards.
I think one of the things that parents might be able to do is challenging, but I'd encourage parents to think about this. We've all overcome adversity to get to where we are, maybe in school, maybe in relationships, maybe in the workplace, and to use some of those examples to show your child, I made it through. Because we tend to not talk about our own emotional health with our kids.
Yeah.
And, there's a limit, of course, to what we should be sharing in that with our kids. But to help them understand that there's another day and this is really hard and you have to acknowledge the pain that they feel that they're in, but put those protections around them and that ability to do exactly what you're doing in therapy, which is to go back and understand and reinforce they've been in bad situations before and have lived through it.
Exactly, yeah. The faith, hope, love, faith, hope, trust, whatever, yeah. In themselves, yeah, and others, and just that things are going to get better. And, it's always challenges are there for us to learn and grow and get better. I
have a really real experience with one of my own children who was just this week competing in a national competition and had gone into it as being one of the favorites to win in her category. And she dropped out. She got kicked. She, lost early and was devastated. And my message back to her was, and thank goodness I had social media, or not social media, but at least the phone and FaceTime to connect with her, right? But my message was, honey, you are more than this one tournament. You have a shelf full of trophies over the span of a year. This is one tournament. Look at the grades you make in school. Look at the friends you have. Look at the job you love. You are more than this one thing. And reinforcing that message to our kids is so important. That, oh my gosh, I'm devastated because my child didn't win. That's the worst thing we can do. reinforcing all those other great things that kiddo has. So critical.
Absolutely. I think that the one thing we're really good at talking about are, how to be good parents, how to be good enough parents, but we don't really focus on taking delight in our children.
Right.
That should be something that's part of parental guidance and whatnot. I think,
right.
Enjoying your kids, that makes them feel good about themselves and accepted, secure in themselves.
Right.
Well, any other thoughts or ideas that you'd like to share about this important topic, Dr. Carney?
I think the last one is, if as a parent you see the warning signs in your child, you have every right to know what that child is looking at and to go into their search histories. As a parent, don't give up your right to say that your child has the right to privacy and communication, because you have the responsibility to protect that child, to understand, and to look after them. And so at the end of the day, we think a lot of this is hard as a parent to say no. It's really our responsibility to look back at the histories and to understand your child who may be demoralized or look sad or starting to withdraw or not connecting with their friends like they used to, and spending more time perseverating over something on that phone. Look at those warning signs and act on them.
Awesome. Well, yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Dr. Caroline Carney, thank you so much for joining us once again. This is an excellent conversation. I hope this helps benefit people in the audience.
Thank you, Scott, and for the great work that your podcast brings forward and the information that you can share. Thanks for letting me be part of it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Psychology Talk podcast. Did you know you can find us on the web all over the place? Well, maybe not all over the place, but you can find us on Instagram, you can find us on Facebook, you can find us at Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, loads of places. Please look for us, and if you can, subscribe, like us, leave us a review, send us a comment, a criticism. Hey, we like to hear a lot from people. Go ahead, talk to us. That's why we're here. By the way, this is just a reminder to let you know that all of the material here is for entertainment and informative purposes only. If you do need a therapist or a mental health professional, please seek one out. Music is provided by the band Serenati.